welcome to all our viewers and welcome to a new edition of Africa Today, our show bringing you all the latest news and events happening all around the African continent. My name is Angie Meher and as usual, we begin straight away our episode with a look at some of the news making the headlines. We move to the United Nations that said it is soon to launch a water action program to address water challenges across the world, and several African countries have already made voluntary commitments to the program. The UN program was discussed during the UN Water Conference in New York, where Cairo also emphasized the importance of the Action on Water Adaptation and Resilience International Initiative. We have more details in this story.
Several African countries have made voluntary commitments to the UN program, which will help to close the water management gap. Among other commitments, the establishment of integrated and intelligent policies for enhanced cooperation. The UN Water Conference provided an opportunity to assess the actions of states in support of Sustainable Development Goal 6, SDG 6, which aims to achieve universal access to water by 2030 worldwide. More than 8 years after the UN set this MDG, 418 million Africans still do not have access to even basic drinking water. The other continents of the world, notably Asia and Latin America, are lagging behind. For UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, all hope now lies in the ability to set a new course based on science. Observers say that, for example, the water agenda will be set up to identify voluntary water-related commitments and monitor their progress. The UN Water Mechanism, which was discussed last week, will accompany the implementation of this inspiring, collaborative, transboundary and transformative agenda for sustainable development and resilience, for which more than $300 billion was pledged at the New York conference. It has the potential to unlock at least $1 trillion in socio-economic and ecosystem gains. The statement was made by UN General Assembly President Csaba Kőrösi. Observers say countries will need to use this funding to strengthen water as a basic human right, including reducing pressure on their water systems and ensuring sound decision-making and smart policies. During the conference, Cairo discussed its AWARE initiative, which spurs action on water issues, especially in Africa. The Egyptian Ministry of Irrigation and Water Resources emphasized the importance of the Action on Water Adaptation and Resilience AWARE initiative in addressing water challenges while at the UN Water Conference on Friday. Cairo chaired a session on water challenges in the final day of the activities of the UN 2023 Water Conference. It said the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam's unilateral practices pose existential threats to 150 million people. It also said that as water and climate challenges negatively affects billions of people around the world, AWARE aims to implement projects in the field of adapting to climate change in developing nations, particularly African countries. It said it also seeks to promote cooperation and interlinkages between water and climate action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, especially the sixth goal that aims to ensure access to water and sanitation for all. More than half of Africa's territories are experiencing drought, coupled with a noticeable rise in temperatures.
Still with our news, the American Vice President started a three-nation Africa tour, with her first stop being Ghana. Speaking in the Ghanaian capital, Accra, she pledged $100 million in security aid to Ghana and 4 other West African nations. We have more details in this report.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris said on Monday during a visit to Ghana that the U.S. will provide $100 million to Ghana and 4 other West African countries to help them deal with violent extremism and instability. Harris was in Accra at the start of a week-long three-nation African tour, the latest in a series of visits by senior U.S. officials, as Washington seeks to counter growing Chinese and Russian influence on the continent. During a joint news conference with Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo, Harris said President Biden and she have made clear the U.S. is strengthening partnerships across the continent of Africa. China has invested heavily in Africa in the last 2 decades, particularly in infrastructure, mining, timber and fishing, while Russian private military contractor Wagner Group is providing security assistance in several countries.
We're now delighted to be joined over the telephone by our guests for this afternoon, Mr. Abdul Latif Wahba, the journalist. It's a very good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. And let me start by asking you, how do you see the timing of the U.S. Vice President's visit, Kamala Harris, to Africa?
This is, of course, as a cause for the development and happened in the world. As you know, that the Russian-Ukrainian crisis and the international coalitions against or supporting Ukraine. And as you know, there is at the same time a new conflict, or maybe we can say an older conflict between these countries also, but in Africa. As you know, that the Russian is trying to create a new allies in African continent and with the other country at the same time. And at the same time, you know that the United States is trying at the same time to strengthen its relations with the African countries as to face the Russian extensions in African continent.
Yes.
So we can say it is a new movement for the two superpowers to find and to create a new allies in the African continent. And as you followed and noticed during the last months, for example, some African countries refused the European countries' military bases, like in Benin, like in Malawi, and so on.
Yes.
And they asked the foreign, the European troops. I don't want to name it, but as you know that they are aiming at the French troops in Eastern and Western, in Western Africa. So they asked the French troops to leave their lands, and also, as you know, that the American declared that this is because of the new progress and the new development and the Russian extensions in this area.
Yes, indeed. Now, Mr. Abdellatif, Washington is, as you said, seeking to counter Chinese and Russian influence in the African continent. And speaking in Ghana, Kamala Harris pledged $100 million to Ghana and 4 other West African countries for security aid. And Russia is involved somehow in security situations in the country. Do you see this as a knock to the situation with Russia and the United States?
Yeah, of course. As you know, that how can you create a new ally?
Yes.
It will be through the financial aid, through supporting this the needs of these countries. And you know that during the last decade, for example, since Obama administrations, they ignored the African countries, and at the same time they didn't pay any attention for these countries, although the American administrations in the last decades of last century, they listed these countries in an economic program issued from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is, as you remember, called the new subsidy systems for the African countries.
Yes.
However, they let the African countries to export without considerations to the quota to export, but only raw materials for the American market. So, as you know, that the superpower and the many countries are trying to exploit and to restore their old positions in African continent.
Indeed. Mr. Abdul Latif, why do you see, the United States has lagged behind in injecting investments into Africa in comparison to China and Europe? And whilst European countries are more influential with the security arena in African countries, Chinese countries are now moving, are moving into African countries with regards to infrastructural development. So where does the United States lie in this?
I think the new movement for China, for example, especially in expanding and distributing the Chinese investment over some important African countries, especially in the East Coast and the West Coast at the same time.
Yes.
Now the Chinese, for example, we can say monopolized many ports, many farms, many mining sources, and so on. So they created a new body for the Chinese investment in African countries. At the same time, as you know, that during the last years, for example, we saw a competition between the Chinese and the United between the Chinese, the Russians from one side, against the United States and some European countries. Especially, you notice that, for example, China holds an international summit for Africa, for example, or for the cooperations between China and the African countries.
Yes.
And at the same time, they held another convention between China and Latin America. The United States, at the same time, imitated the same Chinese style or foreign policy in holding at the same time a new convention for the African countries. They called it American African Conventions and so on. So this is an economic and political war between EU
and on that note,
superpowers.
on that note, Mr. Abdul Latif, how do you see the statements, by the Ghanaian president in the press conference that was held with the U.S. Vice President, when he said, he is worried, or he expressed his fear that once again Africa would become a playground for a great power conflict between, the greater powers like the United States and China and Russia?
We have to notice that there is, what can we say,
awareness.
A conscious in the African countries, and they, at the same time, it changed their mindset, especially in order not to let for the others to exploit their natural resources. Now they became a figure or a leader in the international cooperation. They are trying to get their way to improve domestic and local development, and at the same time they asked the compensations from the superpowers like the United States, like European countries at the same time, who exploited and conquered them in the last century, and they took and captured their natural resources. We saw in COP27, for example, in Sharm el-Sheikh, when President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi called for the superpower, for the European, for the American, to compensate the African countries and to help them in developing their main infrastructures, especially in education, in health, in and so on.
Yes.
This is, of course, not only a benefit for the African countries, but also for Europe itself, where they suffered during the last decades from the illegal migration.
Indeed. Right. Very quickly, Mr. Abdellatif, because we're running out of time. In your opinion, why is the U.S. assistance pledged by Harris directed specifically to West Africa in particular at this current moment in time?
I think the American administration is trying to begin with the Western African countries. Because they are so near to the United States, to Latin America, even to the South and North America, and I think that in some times they have a strong relations with some African leaders in this area, and
right.
at the same time they are so wealthy with their natural resources.
Right. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Mr. Abdellatif Wahba, our guest, the journalist. Thank you very, very much, sir, for your time and your insight and for joining us on today's episode of Africa Today. And to wrap up today's edition, we move to the exciting world of sports. And of course, in just a few minutes, the Pharaohs will be facing Malawi with the 24-player squad, which arrived in Malawi in anticipation of their crucial return game in the African Cup of Nations qualifier. More details to follow.
Egypt's national football team arrived in Malawi early on Monday ahead of facing the Flames in the fourth round of the Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers on Tuesday. Egypt's coach said Egypt was the better side against Malawi and deserved a win. The main training session of the return game will be held later on Monday amid final preparations for Tuesday's game. The Pharaohs secured a precious 2-0 home win over Malawi in the third round on Friday to reclaim the top spot in Group D in the prestigious tournament qualifiers. The seven-time African champions Egypt now have 6 points after 3 games, while Malawi is at the bottom with 3 points. Malawi and Ethiopia occupy the third and fourth positions each with 3 points.
Of course, wishing the Egyptian team the best of luck in their match in the next few minutes or so. And that's all we have time for today. And we wrap up today's edition of Africa Today. We do hope you have enjoyed it. My name is Angie Meher. Many thanks for watching.